The name alone carries a weight of secrets, corruption, and unanswered questions. But behind the headlines and court cases lies a file so explosive it could rewrite everything we think we know. According to Senator Ron Wyden, buried deep inside the U.S. Treasury is a document that tracks 4,725 wire transfers worth nearly $1.1 billion, all linked to Epstein's shadowy financial web. Think about that number. 4,725. Each one a potential lead, a trail pointing toward the people and institutions who moved money with one of the most notorious predators of our time.
About its financing and operations that await investigation. Last year, the Biden administration allowed our investigators to look at portions of the file. We did that at the Treasury building. Here is what it says. Treasury's Epstein file details, Mr. President, 4,725 wire transfers. Let me repeat that. 4,725 wire transfers, adding up to nearly $1.1 billion flowing in and out of just one of Mr. Epstein's bank accounts. If you ask me, that is more than 4,000 potential lines of investigation right there. Hundreds of millions more flowed through other accounts. That's even a lot more to investigate. The file shows that Mr. Epstein used multiple Russian banks, which are now under sanctions, to process payments related to sex trafficking. A lot of the women and girls he targeted came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and elsewhere. One shudders to think about the kinds of people who must have been involved in trafficking these women and young girls out of those companies and into the Epstein web of abuse. Again, these are all potential leads, Mr. President, the Department of Justice ought to be digging into. This is about years and years of international sex trafficking. None of this is a hoax. None of it is a scam. And I'd like to say I consider it insulting to the intelligence of the American people for the Trump administration to simply say there is nothing to investigate here. Now, when the Trump administration came in with a lot of fanfare about transparency and openness, I said, I'm going to follow up on that. So I wrote to the Attorney General, Ms. Bondi, Treasury Secretary Bessent, FBI Director Patel, and I asked them all to produce the Epstein file to the Senate Finance Committee so it could be reviewed. In fact, I've made that request multiple times. The Trump commitment to transparency based on the response didn't mean a whole lot because they just refused. Here's what one Treasury official wrote back to me. I'll quote here. The Department of Treasury has previously made documents available relating to the matter in response to your inquiries. Accordingly, we understand that you have the information you seek from the Treasury related to this request. We thank you for your attention to this important issue. Mr. President, for anybody who's familiar with how these discussions go in Washington, D.C., what I just read was code for the bureaucracy saying, you're asking for information, go pound sand. The Trump administration may be trying to close the books on the Epstein sex trafficking, but I want it understood as a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, where we spend a lot of time looking at where substantial sums of money are going, particularly if they may be promoting wrongdoing and helping to evade taxes. We are going to stay on this fight to hold the wealthy individuals accountable for the harm that they clearly were involved in injuring the young women and others in this sex trafficking. So I'm going to have more follow-up for Attorney General Bondi very quickly. As for today, Mr. President, if she doesn't want to do the investigating, doesn't want the DOJ to do it, let me just restate my original demand. Have that Treasury information given to the Senate Finance Committee and have us on a bipartisan basis do our work. That's what we do in important investigations. If the Trump people believe they need additional authority to carry out the requests that I make again this afternoon, let me offer to help them write the bill myself. The idea that there is nothing more to investigate, not when you have 4,000 wire transfers, many of them associated with the possibility of wrongdoing and sex traffic promoting. The idea that you have that.
And yet, instead of transparency, what did the American people get? Silence. Stonewalling. A cover-up so blatant that even members of Congress are being told to back off. This isn't speculation, it's data. Hard numbers pulled straight from financial records. Numbers that should have launched a massive investigation but instead were locked away in a cabinet, hidden from the very public that deserves the truth. Wyden stood on the Senate floor and dropped the kind of bombshell the Department of Justice refuses to touch. He laid out what the administration won't admit. Epstein's crimes weren't just about abuse. They were about money, power, and networks that reached across borders. Russian banks under sanction. Victims trafficked from overseas. Billions moving under the radar. So the question isn't just who Epstein was. The real question is, who was he protecting, and who is protecting him even now? Senator Ron Wyden didn't step onto the Senate floor with vague theories or recycled talking points. He came armed with numbers, hard, undeniable figures pulled straight from the Treasury's Epstein file. According to Wyden, investigators documented 4,725 separate wire transfers, moving in and out of Epstein's accounts, adding up to nearly $1.1 billion. Let that sink in. This wasn't petty cash or scattered deposits. This was the kind of financial activity you'd expect from a global syndicate, not a single disgraced financier. Wyden made it clear that each one of those transfers is a potential lead, thousands of threads that, if pulled, could unravel a network of unimaginable scale. Where did the money come from? Who authorized it? And more importantly, who benefited from it? The sheer size of these transactions suggests far more than the actions of one man living beyond his means. It points to a system, an operation, something far larger than Epstein himself. The senator's remarks weren't whispers or speculative claims. They were built on verifiable documents reviewed inside the Treasury building itself. And yet, despite the weight of this evidence, the file remains locked away, untouched by investigators who should have been the first to act. Wyden's bombshell was simple but devastating. The financial paper trail of Jeffrey Epstein doesn't just exist. It's been mapped out in shocking detail. The problem isn't finding the truth. The problem is that those in power are refusing to follow it. If the billion-dollar transfers weren't disturbing enough, the destinations of some of those payments raise even darker questions. Senator Wyden revealed that Epstein's financial web ran directly through multiple Russian banks, institutions that are now sanctioned for corruption, money laundering, and ties to organized crime. These weren't harmless transactions lost in the shuffle of global finance. They were movements of massive sums routed through entities already flagged as security threats to the United States. And then comes the most chilling detail: the victims. Records and survivor accounts show that many of the young women drawn into Epstein's orbit came from Russia, Belarus, and Turkey, countries where vulnerability can be exploited, where poverty and coercion open the door for traffickers. The overlap is impossible to ignore, money flowing through Russian institutions, while victims from the same regions were being transported and abused. It begins to look less like isolated criminal behavior and more like a coordinated pipeline. A system where finances and exploitation move hand in hand, shielded by layers of international banking secrecy. The kind of operation that doesn't just thrive, It requires cooperation from people in high places to survive. What Wyden exposed isn't a simple case of one predator using his wealth for personal depravity. It's the suggestion of an entire infrastructure built to facilitate trafficking on a global scale. The money doesn't just tell a story. It tells us there were others involved, powerful enough to move billions and make it vanish into the shadows. The most unsettling part of Senator Wyden's revelation isn't just the staggering numbers or the international reach. It's what happened next. Normally, when billions of dollars in suspicious transactions tied to a known trafficker surface, it triggers alarms across every agency. Investigators swarm, subpoenas fly, and the system responds. But in this case, the opposite happened. Instead of urgency, there was silence. Instead of transparency, there was a wall of resistance. Wyden described how he formally requested that the Treasury and Justice Department release the Epstein file so the Senate Finance Committee could conduct its own review. Not once, but multiple times. These weren't informal questions or quiet favors. These were official inquiries made by a sitting senator with oversight authority. Yet every request was met with bureaucratic evasion. The message was clear: stop asking. At one point, Treasury officials even responded in writing, insisting that enough documents had already been made available. Wyden called it what it was: bureaucratic code for go pound sand. In Washington, that phrase is as old as politics itself. It's a polite way of telling an elected official to shut up and move on. Think about that. A United States senator, armed with evidence of thousands of suspicious transactions tied to human trafficking, was brushed aside by the very institutions tasked with defending the country from financial crimes. The agencies with the power to uncover the truth chose to bury it instead. This isn't incompetence. It's not oversight. It looks like deliberate obstruction, the kind of coordinated stonewalling designed to protect something or someone far more dangerous than one disgraced financier. When powerful departments close ranks against transparency, it raises a darker possibility that exposing Epstein's financial ties would expose others, people embedded deep inside politics, finance, and global influence. And that's the chilling reality Wyden put on the record. The problem isn't the absence of evidence. The problem is the refusal to act on it. When Senator Wyden demanded accountability, one name stood out more than any other: Pam Bondi. As Florida's Attorney General, Bondi was no stranger to the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein. Florida, after all, was where many of his most horrific acts took place: abuse hidden behind walls of luxury, sealed deals, and questionable legal arrangements that allowed him to evade full justice for years. If anyone should have understood the scope of what was happening, it was her. And yet, when faced with the opportunity to dig deeper, she stayed silent. Wyden's call for answers wasn't aimed at anonymous bureaucrats. He directed his requests directly to the top: the Attorney General, the Treasury Secretary, and the FBI Director. And in that chain of responsibility, Bondi's position was impossible to ignore. As someone who built her career in Florida law enforcement, she knew how Epstein operated, how he manipulated the system, and how victims were failed time and again. But when the moment came for leadership, her response was not investigation, it was deflection. Consider what that means. A senior official who had the power to demand files, launch probes, and insist on justice chose not to. Instead of championing transparency, she joined the silence. Instead of defending survivors, she defended the bureaucracy. That choice sends a clear message: protecting the system mattered more than uncovering the truth. And it's not just about inaction. It's about proximity. Bondi wasn't a distant observer. She was a key figure in the very state where Epstein built his empire of abuse. Florida was ground zero, and she had the authority to confront it head-on. But at every critical turn, she stepped back. The Treasury's refusal to cooperate, the Justice Department's indifference, the FBI's evasions, all of it created a wall, and Bondi stood on the inside of that wall, not the outside. This raises an uncomfortable question. Was it simply a lack of courage? Or was it something more, an active choice to shield names, connections, and networks that stretched far beyond Epstein himself? Wyden's outrage makes sense in that context. He wasn't just fighting for numbers on a page. He was fighting against a system where those tasked with enforcing the law appeared more committed to protecting reputations than protecting victims. Bondi's silence became more than just a failure of duty. It became part of the cover-up. And in the world of politics and power, silence can be as damning as action. Senator Wyden made one thing crystal clear: silence wasn't an option. If the Department of Justice and the Treasury wouldn't act, then Congress had to step in. On the Senate floor, he demanded the release of the full Treasury file, not summaries, not redacted fragments, but the entire record of Epstein's financial dealings. Only then, he argued, could the American people finally see the scope of what had been hidden. This wasn't just about political grandstanding. Wyden emphasized that the Senate Finance Committee, a body with direct oversight of financial crimes, was prepared to review the data on a bipartisan basis. That detail mattered. It stripped away the idea that this was a partisan fight. What he was calling for was transparency, accountability, and the chance to pursue thousands of potential leads buried in the numbers. Wyden even went further, offering to draft legislation himself if agencies claimed they needed new authority. That's how determined he was to remove every excuse standing in the way. He understood what was at stake. If billions can move through the U.S. financial system tied to a known trafficker and no one investigates, then the system itself is complicit. For Wyden, the path was simple. Release the files, follow the money, and let the facts speak louder than the silence that has surrounded Epstein for years. At its core, the Epstein scandal has never been just about one man. What Senator Wyden revealed highlights a much larger truth. This was about power, money, and the institutions that chose to look the other way. The wire transfers, the Russian banking connections, the international victims. Each piece points towards something systemic. Epstein may have been the face of it, but the machinery behind him required networks, facilitators, and protectors. That's why the locked Treasury file matters so much. It isn't just a list of numbers. It's a map. A roadmap of financial trails that could expose who enabled Epstein, who profited from his crimes, and who had enough influence to bury the evidence. And yet, instead of treating this as a chance to deliver justice, powerful agencies acted as gatekeepers, ensuring that the map remained sealed from the public. This is where the bigger picture becomes terrifying. Because if billions of dollars linked to trafficking can pass through sanctioned banks, if thousands of questionable transfers can be flagged and ignored, then the system itself is compromised. It means corruption isn't the exception, it's baked into the process. And that's the part survivors and the public can't ignore. The silence isn't just about shielding one predator. It's about shielding a network of influence that stretches across politics, finance, and international borders. The refusal to investigate sends a dangerous message that justice is conditional, that accountability bends to power, and that the most vulnerable can be sacrificed to protect the most connected. Wyden's warning wasn't just about Epstein's file. It was about what it represents, a test of whether the system serves justice or whether it serves power. When you strip away the political noise, what remains are the facts. For 1,725 wire transfers, $1.1 billion. Foreign banks flagged for corruption. Victims trafficked across borders. And a file that could answer questions officials seemed desperate to avoid. None of this is speculation. None of it is rumor. It's hard data, sitting in a government cabinet, waiting for the courage to bring it into the light. Senator Wyden's message was simple: follow the money, and you follow the truth. The tragedy is that the very institutions meant to uphold justice are the ones blocking that path. That silence isn't just bureaucratic delay, it's protection. Protection for reputations, protection for networks, and protection for the powerful. And that's where this story stretches beyond Jeffrey Epstein. Because if evidence this massive can be hidden, if financial trails this glaring can be ignored, what else is being covered up? What other truths are quietly locked away, never to be seen by the public? The real test isn't whether we know Epstein was guilty. The real test is whether the system built to protect people will finally protect the vulnerable or continue to shield the elite. If you believe the truth matters, don't let this moment vanish. Share this video. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And most importantly, drop a comment below demanding the release of the Epstein financial files. Because sunlight is the only thing that can break this darkness.